Hello, my name is Paul Marchbanks, and this is Digging in the Dirt, with a few spoiler-filled observations about another film I'd like to class as redemptively grotesque, Calvary, a tale written and directed by John Michael McDonagh and set in County Sligo, Ireland. I'll say a few words about humanity's love-hate relationship with violence by way of Irish poetry and a couple modernist novels, discuss the use of shock in storytelling, and then consider how McDonagh's Calvary presents a profoundly different perspective on human suffering than we find in some of his other movies. In the wake of Ireland's 1916 Eastern Rebellion, W.B. Yeats suggested in the poem The Rose Tree that bloodshed might just be necessary for national transformation, a sacrifice of human lives he labels in the companion poem Easter 1916 a terrible beauty born of an excess of love. 2 decades later, he questions this romanticization of death, wondering in the poem Man in the Echo whether his early play Kathleen na Houlihan had sent out, quote, certain men the English shot. Yeats appears conflicted, recognizing that the role he played in the Irish literary Renaissance helped stir up trouble, sharpening a rebellious nationalism that led to not only political change, but a substantial loss of life. These works together ask the question, can bloodshed ever be redemptive? Our confused attitude towards violence today, that flash of outrage which fades swiftly into weary indifference, is in part an inheritance bestowed by modernists like Yeats and his British contemporaries across the Irish Sea. In Virginia Woolf's novel The Waves, 24-year-old Bernard proves unable to hold on to sorrow for more than 30 minutes. He genuinely laments the abrupt death of his friend, Percival, but buries grief deeply in his mind and hopes for a poetic revelation at some later date. What he calls, quote, the machine of society quickly pulls him back into its rhythms, his thoughts sliding towards, quote, books and little ornaments and the usual sounds of tradesmen calling. Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent allows a policeman examining an exploded corpse to imagine, quote, the pangs of inconceivable agony contained between 2 winks of an eye. Yet the novel also recognizes the public's collective disinterest in large-scale death and destruction. Another one of Conrad's characters, an administrator at the London embassy of an undisclosed Slavic country, feels comparatively little when considering violence. The philosophy of bomb throwing that Vladimir recommends to a secret agent is both ridiculously absurd and eerily rational. The embassy's first secretary holds that violence with an identifiable cause makes little ripple in the social pond. Assassination attempts on national leaders have become almost conventional. An outrage committed against a church will inevitably inspire someone to give the event the character of a religious manifestation, dulling its otherwise tragic edge. To truly unsettle the bourgeoisie, Vladimir argues, one must create a purely destructive event that cannot be explained away by bored journalists, something nonsensical, the meaning of which will remain elusive. Few readers will salute Vladimir's goal, creating a disruption so bewildering that Londoners demand a crackdown on political dissidents, but we can admit the power of his twisted logic. Our jaded imaginations do refuse to grant violence, reduced to statistics and boilerplate language, the weight it should carry, unless it happens to us. Flannery O'Connor, an American-born descendant of Irish immigrants and a devoted fan of Conrad's fiction, mirrors Vladimir's shock principle in her own work, noting that while there are ages when it is possible to woo the reader, there are others when something more drastic is necessary. Reaching the benumbed, world-weary individual moving their internal needle even a few increments requires a truly surprising provocation. Screenwriter and director John Michael McDonagh has operated on this very assumption across his 4 feature films, swinging widely between dark and bloody comedy that recalls Quentin Tarantino and the Coen brothers, and soul-wrenching extremes that offer a rare illustration of transformative hope. McDonagh's first and third films wildly lampoon the same mechanism of law enforcement which Conrad's Vladimir wants to speed up, by showing how slowly and inconsistently policemen can respond when faced with criminal behavior. The Guard opens with Brendan Gleeson's Sergeant Jerry Boyle, a member of the Garda Síochána, rolling slowly up to a drug-related car accident, checking methodically for pulses, and proceeding to get high on the contents of one of the corpse's pockets. Sergeant Boyle breaks as many laws as he upholds over the course of the film, providing a rollicking ride filled with oblique social commentary, but no deeper musings. War on Everyone begins in similar fashion, 2 cops deciding to hit a mime they've chased down instead of getting out of the car and reading him his rights. The sequence is played for laughs, answering the age-old question of whether a mime would make a sound when struck with great force. Later in the film, one of the 2 learns from his new girlfriend that her father died from a suicide murder. In killing himself, that is, he inadvertently killed a bystander. His daughter wonders whether such an act could truly be considered murder, since her dad was technically dead before the bullet escaped his cranium and wreaked collateral damage. This morbid humor, unalleviated by the 2 cops' occasional pseudo-philosophical digressions about the nature of reality and the problem of pain. Comedy provides both the frothy foam and a violent undertow of both films. In his second and fourth films, however, McDonagh pulls back from the cliff's edge along which his other scripts dance, and allows metaphysical introspection to overtake witty, barbed repartee. Calvary and The Forgiven both allow the heft of violence to weigh on their characters. The Forgiven opens with yet another fatal car accident, this time perpetrated by an intoxicated, callous, and incredibly wealthy tourist in Morocco who attempts to shrug off the death of a young boy and distract himself with merrymaking. A journey into the desert and into himself reveals guilt he failed to bury, and expiation requires yet another death. Whether the forgiveness touted by the film's title is either offered or received remains a mystery unresolved by the film's abrupt and enigmatic ending. Calvary, released in 2014, also closes with a lead character's death, and similarly avoids explicit messaging, yet manages to provide an acutely spiritual, hopeful vision of redemption juxtaposed against a portrait of a broken world. McDonagh accomplishes this by exhuming some of the same issues tackled by films like The Magdalene Sisters and Spotlight, questioning whether a religious institution which has so profoundly abused its followers' trust can still provide healing to those desperate for it. Irish clergy praised long ago for protecting key elements of Western civilization after Rome's decline, preserving and copying endangered Greek and Latin manuscripts, must today contend with the Emerald Isle's rapid abandonment of faith, a decades-old flight accelerated by continuous revelations about abuses perpetrated by nuns and priests alike. McDonagh's representation of sexual atrocity and violence in Calvary underscores the deep scars left by betrayal and assault, while proffering hope in the shape of forgiveness, a potential antidote to the cycle of injury and reprisal that has characterized so many aspects of Irish history. In doing so, his film illustrates the features of an uncommon breed of story I have come to recall the redemptively grotesque. In this kind of story, 1, the plot examines the severe consequences of human brokenness and refuses to write off our failings as a mere product of environmental conditions and inadequate therapy. 2, a character cracks and falls to their knees, sometimes literally, following a personal failure. The crisis involves sordid details likely to unsettle the audience, such as disease, addiction, violence, disability, or destructive sexual behavior, and sometimes a combination of many of those variables. 3. This figure eventually recognizes their limitations and need for outside assistance, a prospect of rescue somehow tied to the divine, whether this assistance is accepted or rejected. Calvary makes it clear that this tiny town in Sligo is filled with all the brokenness humanity has on offer, but instead of turning fallibility into parodic foibles, as he does elsewhere, McDonagh here opposes comic nonchalance with somber reflection. Once again, a car accident brought on by substance abuse ends life, but this time, the predictable attempt to mock death falls flat. The attending doctor's wry observation that he'd like to be under the sea like the dead marine biologist, and that the morgue is the best place for the 4 drunken kids who caused the accident, provokes Father James' exasperated retort. "Every life is sacred, Frank, for God's sake." The contrast with McDonagh's previous film is all the starker given that Brendan Gleeson again plays the lead, this time administering last rites to a dying man whose wife's faith is decidedly not shaken by the kind of trauma McDonagh will return to treating ironically in his next film. So with Suicide, Father James' seemingly tasteless response to his visiting daughter's bandaged wrists, he jokes that Fiona made the classic error of cutting the wrong direction, miscarries when Dr. Frank makes the same jest. James' own words are an effort to diffuse awkwardness and jumpstart a relationship injured by living apart from his daughter for so long. I'll leave it to you to determine whether the two managed to successfully untangle their knotted relationship and reaffirm their affection before the film ends. Father James' efforts to interrupt others' dysfunctional behavior prove rather mixed. A married woman who unabashedly frolics with a man other than her husband has no crisis of conscience, despite James' repeated efforts to provoke course-correcting introspection. And the pub owner complains that priests like James never seem to preach about the sins committed by the elite, by corrupt bankers who foreclose on businesses like his own. Father James does, however, make some headway with one of those very bankers, the abrasive arrogance which leads Michael Fitzgerald to piss, literally, on Hans Holbein's painting The Ambassadors in a display of indifferent superiority, gradually melts away. Michael later seeks spiritual guidance in genuinely contrite fashion, and though a sex worker who performs a practiced indifference responds to the priest's question about whether he needs help with, "There's nothing wrong with me, Father, I'm feeling fine," the film's closing montage suggests that he has been moved by the priest's kindness and may be reconsidering his line of work. The most profound shift, surprisingly, may take place in Father James himself, a man recognized by the townspeople as a pretty good, non-judgmental kind of guy. He's a very kind and truthful man who does not deny the many accusations cast at Catholicism by the locals, half of whom apparently have a grudge against the church. Though our priest asks searching questions of the villagers throughout the week, he does not judge them harshly, nor preach hellfire from the pulpit. In fact, as he tells Fiona, he thinks all the discussion of sin needs to be balanced with more talk about virtues like forgiveness, and he proceeds to provide a memorable illustration I'll allow you to discover for yourself. The film opened with an unidentified parishioner in the confessional box disclosing that as a child he was raped by a priest every other day for 5 years, and that he means to shock the community by killing not an accused and guilty priest, his attacker is now dead, but the benevolent Father James himself, because, and here he echoes the logic of Conrad's Vladimir, no one would expect it. The nameless man suggests that they meet in a week's time down at the beach, leaving the audience to wonder for the next 90 minutes who the would-be murderer is, and whether Father James will allow himself to die. What do you think? Does the film burn Christianity to the ground as completely as the fire which destroys Father James' church? Or does it seriously consider, in the midst of violence, a faith that preaches confession and forgiveness?